Good afternoon, everybody. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the Executive Director of Karis Circle. Karis Circle is a nonprofit programming arm of Karis Books, and Karis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We are also the school store for Agnes Scott College, who is the joint producer of today's event, particularly the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies Department at Agnes Scott. We're thrilled to bring you this lunchtime lecture with Dr. Kathryn Bond Stockton and Dr. Lauran Whitworth. Dr. Lauran Whitworth is an assistant professor of women's, gender, sexuality studies and the co-director of the Environmental and Sustainability Studies program at Agnes Scott College. She uses both they and she pronouns. So their scholarly work has appeared in feminist theory, intersections, women's and gender studies, and review across disciplines, and CAA.reviews. Her current book project, Environmental Eros, Picturing Feminist, Queer, and Trans Ecologies, brings together gender and sexuality studies, environmental studies, and film studies. Prior to earning their PhD, Lauran taught high school English for several years. When she isn't teaching, grading papers, and serving on faculty committees, Professor Whitworth enjoys gardening, watching films, and hiking with her partner and their dog. So welcome, Lauran. We're thrilled to have you with us today to be in conversation with Dr. Kathryn Bond Stockton, who is a distinguished professor of English and inaugural dean of the School of Cultural and Social Transformation at the University of Utah. She is the author of Beautiful Bottom, Beautiful Shame, Where Black Meets Queer, The Queer Child, or Growing Sideways in the 20th Century, both finalists for the Lambda Literary Award in LGBT Studies, and Making Out, which was a finalist for the Next Generation Indie Book Award for Memoir, among other books. So we are here today to discuss genders, and it's a little book. I'm working from home, so I don't have it with me. I realized belatedly, but hopefully, yes, there we go. And a little book for a big subject. So we want to encourage all of you who are watching at home to please put your questions in the Ask a Question box, which is in the bottom center of the screen, or feel free, if you're watching on a phone and that's cumbersome, you can put it in the chat and I'll move it over, and Dr. Whitworth will assimilate those questions into the conversation. So we just have an hour, so I'm going to get out of the way so that we can really go deep with both of you, but it's a real honor. Dr. Stockton, we have been huge fans of all of your books since the very beginning, so we're thrilled that this virtual format actually allows us to get to hang out together. So thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, E.R. Well, hello, Lauran.
Ditto. Hi, Kathryn. So good to see you.
Right.
And I do want to share with folks that we met for the first time years ago when I was a grad student at Emory, and you were just the warmest, most approachable, and kind campus visitor. And I haven't forgotten that. And I think you can tell a lot about a person, especially an academic, by how they treat grad students and support staff. So it is a treat to be in conversation with someone whose mind is incredibly sharp and whose heart and kindness also shows.
Oh, well, thank you for those incredibly kind words. And would they were true, I shall live to be the person you've described. And it's just so great to be reconnected with you. Love it. So thanks for having me here.
And I just also wanted to say thanks to ER and Dartricia and also Molly at MIT Press for making this happen. So thank you folks for the invitation. So ER definitely struck on something in that description that hit me. I love alliteration, but this is a petite book, and it is also pithy and very potent. You pack a lot into a relatively small space. So that's one place I thought we could start.
Sure.
Is just about where does one begin when tasked with writing a relatively short, almost pocket-sized book on gender?
Well, funny enough, I think one starts by saying no. So MIT came to me and they wanted this book written. I think we'll probably get to that in a moment. Like, is there a need for such a book, or why would they? Why did MIT think there was a need, right? So there's an interesting question there. But when they came to me, I just felt like I cannot write that book. You know, I've been teaching gender studies, first women's studies back in the day when it was framed that way, and then gender studies, well, for about 34 years. So I thought, how in the world can I tackle this subject that is so large, and at this point in time has so many intriguing corners to get into, right? So I will just say then the way that I did begin thinking that I can't tackle this, part of it was I was not sure I could tell the history of the concept. You know, as I thought about the history, and we'll probably tackle that later too, I just thought, I don't know where I would begin. And then I read a book that is so near and dear to my heart that I just so highly recommend to everybody. This is Jules Gill Peterson's book, Histories of the Transgender Child. And that was the book that gave me the feeling I can write this book, intriguingly enough. So that's what I did. And maybe I'll just sort of say a little bit more. I don't know, should I talk a little bit about process? Is that helpful?
I think so, for sure. Just walk us through how you went. One thing I really love about the book is you put us into conversation with so many different folks, and also so many sort of moments, almost like vignettes. And so as I was reading it, I kept thinking to myself, how in the world did she sort of gather all of these and sort of keep track of it? 1 minute we're in history, and then sociology, and then you know, in indigenous studies, et cetera.
Yeah. So one of the things I did that I do recommend to everybody is I read a lot of magazines. You know, I read pretty broadly across the magazine spectrum. So I was always looking to see what is being talked about in magazines, what intriguing little things are sort of coming to the fore, you know, whether it's Time magazine, or maybe I'm reading the New Yorker, or maybe I see something in the newspaper. So I'd constantly sort of be clipping those things out and meditating on those things. And then as I thought about this book, one of the things that I was very passionate about is I wanted this book in many ways to show the education that I have received in 34 years by reading just amazing people, sometimes in my field, sometimes outside of my field, but quite primarily queer and trans scholars, scholars of color, and queer and trans scholars of color. I just felt like if this book can do anything and send folks to these remarkable works that have educated me, I've gotten educated by reading, then this book would do some service. And so that's why I don't sort of like stuff citations, you know, in the footnotes. I mean, there are footnotes, and there are more people I name in footnotes, but I really wanted people to feel in this book, you know, a whole series of scholars that are important to my way of thinking, and to really see these ideas as coming from those scholars, even if my job is kind of nutshell them or dramatize some part of their idea or sort of paraphrase it in some way that works for the kind of sequence and flow of the book. Getting people seduced to go to these scholars was really key. I will just say, none of these scholars need my help in life. They are deservedly lauded and famous and have done incredible work in their career. So that's not the point that I'm making. But really, I did not want this book to be one white person who is queer and genderqueer, just sort of like my take on things. I wanted this book to be a compilation of many different takes. So that was really something that I cared about. And one thing I'll just say, I don't know if this has struck you, one of the things that really bothers me about academia is the kind of false story that we end up telling, right, about citation. So I can cite different scholars. That's not hard to do. I can bring them into the body of the text. But to really honor the conversations that are taking place with an amazing staff member, you know, with an administrative student, administrative assistant, a student here, a student there, an entire class full of students at my dinner table. It is really hard to have a citational practice that could ever do justice to the education that I have had from staff and students, and of course, an entire range of friends and even family. So I don't know how we will deal with that in the future in academia, but I think it's a real downside to the way that academia thinks about citation. So that was some of the process that I went through.
I think that's such a great point. When talking about citation, I think about Sarah Ahmed's Living a Feminist Life, and then she makes a point in the book to only or to not cite cis white men at all in the book. And so I think that's really, really interesting to think about in the context of your book, and the ways that you go to academic and scholarly works, but you also you also go to, everyday happenings and to, gender border patrol agent shooting gender reveal target. You go
Right.
to everyday happenings and also,
Yes.
Billy Porter's Oscar attire and pop culture as well.
Yeah.
And I think that's a kind of like democratizing citational practice too, is what you're choosing to sort of highlight in the world. I think you really do a beautiful job of pulling from not only different academic fields, but life as well.
Yeah, I can't just underscore strongly enough, particularly staff and academic environments. I feel that one of the things that happens in our academic environments is there's constant focus on professors and students. Great, of course, that's a logical connection. But staff who run the institutions that we're in and the tremendous staff wisdom and knowledge that keeps everything running and actually is constantly educating professors and students, we have to find a way to really honor that labor, because otherwise we're not telling the truth about academic institutions.
I think that's so important, and I'm sure you've witnessed and experienced this in your administrative roles that you've been doing now for almost for a decade.
Yes. Yes.
So one question I wanted to jump right in for folks who haven't had the delightful experience of reading the book yet. And the book has, it almost reminded me as a film person of intertitles in old school films, where some of your really evocative, some of these potent and evocative statements are pulled out for the reader. And one of your central claims is that gender is queer for everyone, and that everyone's gender is strange.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that, and just for folks in the audience, some of the really interesting things that Dr. Stockton does is not only troubling the sex-gender distinction and the relationship between sex, gender, and sexuality, but also pushing back on notions of kind of taken for granted truisms like the opposite sex, or even cisgender as a term that has become very, very popular. So just talk to us a little bit about those interventions and sort of what you feel is at stake in that.
Yeah, thank you. Wonderful question. Well, so one of the things that the reader, I think, will quickly learn is that what I mean by queer is not simply LGBTQIA+, right? Obviously, that's included in so much of what I'm talking about, but I don't mean queer as that sort of particular set of identity categories. So queer, one has to keep going back to another dictionary definition, right in the dictionary, simply meaning strange. And of course, that's a move that queer theorists often make, right? That we're talking about the strangeness of this entire scene for all of us. And the reason why I think that's important is I think now really not a week goes by when somebody doesn't grab me and say, oh, Kathryn, you need to talk to so-and-so. Usually often it's a parent or a friend, a relative of somebody who very bravely has put themselves forward and says, I am not this that you think I am this. And so people are like coming to me to try to get help, as it were. I think this was part of what MIT was thinking about. But of course, I always want to turn that on its head and say, yes, of course, I'm very happy that you want to understand. That's really key to education. But I also want to turn this back on you. Gender is strange for you, whoever you may be. So you're coming to me because you think you've heard something strange that your child is saying, or that your relative is saying, or that your friend is saying. But let me tell you, we are all inside the system, and it's queer for every one of us. So I am going to, you had asked me if there was something I could just read from the book. And so nobody feel like, uh-oh, big reading coming on. Literally, you're going to hear 2 paragraphs, all right, that I think will get at this. So you'll get a little bit of a flavor of the writing of the book, but you will also, I think, get to the bottom of this question. So this is sort of one of the 3 claims of the book. Gender is queer, by which I mean irredeemably strange, ungraspable, out of sync with male and female, in quotation marks, weirdly not normal, since lived gender fails to conform to normative ideals and expectations, even when it is played quite straight. Conventional views try to snuff this strangeness, yet conventional views are strange. Try this on for a very queer idea. Raise two human beings to think they're opposites. Give them opposite traits to embody. Establish different mindsets, behaviors, and interests. Offer them opposite aesthetics to pursue. Then ask these opposites to live together, love together, parent together as they raise little opposites. Call this marriage as it was intended. Call this normal gendering. Isn't this strange? And one more little paragraph here. This is in another section of the book where I try to really get at this thing that I call normative strangeness, all right? Consider, for example, one man, one woman. For the sake of argument, let's say I've seen their genitals, so I can vouch that their genitals are different. These are friends, so I haven't seen their genitals. I'm going on faith. Now, he's a white professor. She is too. Both went to Harvard. That's where they met. And both did doctorates in the humanities. Both wear clothes from the Gap or J. Crew, or when dressing up, they splurge on tweeds. Both are ambitious, professionally accomplished, occasionally witty, and relatively in touch with their emotions, at least for academics. Both report enjoying erotic stimulation of the same orifice. Use your imagination. Question, is this couple so much the same in interests, racial designation, job, salary, dress, and even focus on bodily orifice of the same gender, but not the same sex? Are they homosexual in some strange sense? So this is where I'm trying to really just sort of turn it back on the people that we might call cisgender or something else in this world and say, constantly imagining that somebody else's gendering is strange is really not understanding the stretchy system that really stretches over all of us, at least for most of us at birth. And that's the heart of the strangeness argument.
I love those passages too. I could sort of hear you reading them as I was reading the book. And one thing that I think it's delightful about the book is these moments of sort of you flipping gender and these common presumptions on their head a bit, and asking questions we maybe haven't considered before. I think is a really powerful part of the book, even those of us who are in gender studies or think a lot about gender.
And I found that sort of helped too with these parents, who come forward, because again, I think what people need to stop doing is imagine that they now must understand this other strangeness, that they're studying a group of people. How do they dress? How do they eat? Where do they live? I mean, this used to happen with gay people commonly, still does, right? But I think when I can get parents to sort of understand themselves inside the system, then I see a kind of aha moment that begins to reframe that conversation inside that family. Again, not always, not saying that this always takes, but I think that might be an intervention for us to try to make. So yeah, sorry, Lauran, you were in the midst of going somewhere else, maybe.
No, not at all. And I love your descriptions of also the role, obviously, of caretakers and parents in gender acculturation, which is something many of us have probably thought about, that you really poignantly describe. You talk about gender being draped up upon us, et cetera. There's so many just moments where your descriptions just really, I think, beautifully make these points. Another what you say is one of the sort of mantra of the book is word and system. And I'll put that here. I'll put it in the chat for folks. If it'll let me chat it went. So you say it's an unsexy mantra, but I think it's clearly a useful and apt way to describe these nodes of gender and race and gender and class throughout history and the overview you give us. Tell us how you landed on word and system, and maybe explain to folks in the audience what you think it reveals about gender.
Yeah, I was so disappointed that I couldn't find something that I myself would consider like a sexy formulation, and I play around with the idea of not cake, not buffet, meaning gender is not a piece of cake, nod to the gender reveal parties, and also not a buffet, that's too easy to imagine, like, oh, now we have all this latitude and we can just choose. I don't think that's telling the story for many people who have no latitude to choose or to be able to express themselves and to be honored in that expression. So word and system, again, not exciting, but I felt like this is the clearest rendering that I wanted to note something about gender, that even though obviously we live it individually, many of us who would take issue with the category of the individual, right, which has been a kind of capitalist, kind of bourgeois category for people that I think is not really true to how we live our lives collectively, intersubjectively, so I think I wanted to get at this idea that gender strangely is often running above us, where we can't control it, that it is lowered from on high upon our bodies, and it's also strangely running beneath us, which is to say it runs at almost a cellular level of words that are constantly running through our bodies. So I'll say just a bit about both of those, though this may be self-explanatory, but gender running above us, right? Best example, I think, is that cone, that word cone that is lowered at birth. You come out of the birth canal and somebody's already deemed you a boy or a girl by a reading of one of your 5 fetal layers of sex, the only one that can be seen if you're a sighted person. So this from on high starts right from the get-go for many of us. There might be some parents out there not sexing a baby, but it seems to be still wildly commonly practiced. And of course, that's something also that once parents get going with it, they're not controlling either, right? So you can try to do gender creative parenting, and God bless people who are doing it. I love what people are attempting. But even there, if you don't sex gender a baby at birth, it feels like the system is waiting for that child, right? I sort of describe this in the book as salmon swimming upstream. And I hope those children enjoy that delightful swim that they're having, but the words and the system and the expectations are still often waiting for them. So the system, comes upon so many of us, no matter even what happens out of the birth canal. So that's a sort of system notion. And I will just say, I think the word system now is more common in mainstream thinking, because after the murder of George Floyd, there was so much powerful conversation about race and the system of racism. So that was a word sort of pre-murder. And I started this book about a month before the George Floyd murder. I was using it and thinking, will people really understand the system word? But I think actually now it's more common. Then just a word about words, right? So I wrote an entire book. I was looking to see if I had a copy, another little book called Making Out. And this book is about what it means, and it's happening right now between you and me, that unless we would have some magical condom we could put on our heads, my words are getting in your body, your words are getting in my body, other people are listening in, and unless they've turned off their sound, our words are getting in them. So that literally words are constantly flowing through us all through the day. And those little cellular ant-like words, in some ways, maybe they don't remain, but some of these big words, again, back to boy and girl, and all the racialized concepts that surround them, are so massive, but these systems are riding on the back of these tiny little ant-like forms. So I wanted to get at that gender sort of streaming above us and below us and figuring out how powerful that may be. And indeed, just one more thing I'll say about this. Not only do we often lower that cone of the boy word or the girl word at birth, but then we're so intent on fortifying this thing, as if it won't take unless we fortify it, that we keep putting that girl word and boy word inside child bodies before they can even say who they are, right? And so, as I say, that is not a consenting process for babies, for newborns, for children who are growing. That is often done without their consent. And that might be something that we rigorously want to take a look at in our society, in our culture. And now I don't know, Lauren, if you have frozen. So I don't know. I would just give, okay, there you are. Do we have you back? Or shall I say something more?
I think you should say something more while Lauren returns.
Okay, great. I'll just say, because I think at one point in our conversation, Lauren was wondering, how would you teach this in an intro to gender studies class? What would an example of this be? And I'll give sort of two quick examples. I could give a very personal example from my earliest memories. I wanted this boy word, let's just say. I wanted this boy word that comes from the system of gender to be aimed at me. It was a very strong desire that I had to be able to participate. Okay. And ER, can you hear me okay? Shall I continue?
Yes, please continue. I'm going to work on getting Lauren back on screen.
Okay, great. So at any rate, the sort of wish that we have as children sometimes for words that are not the ones being applied to us. I have a whole kind of full example of this that I would give in class about what it means to actually wish for a word the culture will not put upon you, and how hard that is. In many ways, I could not ditch the girl word. I couldn't get the boy word. So I fell in between them, impaled upon both. And that really shows how the system and the word often come together, that the system is using these words for us and treating us in this systemic way, really, again, at the level of these tiny little words, but words that mean so much. One other thing that I think I would say about this as an example is that the way in which gender is occurring in this sort of massive communal situation, but also has to be lived, sometimes in very solitary ways. So towards the end of one of my chapters, I talk about queer migration movements. And this comes from a great book by Karma Chavez, where she's sort of introducing us to what was happening, particularly around 2010, with queer migration movements, the new category of undocuqueer. And you really get a sense of the system surrounding that sort of intersectional play between queer and migrant. But then I go to Cherie Moraga, and I go back to some of those 1970s writings from Cherie Moraga, really telling her own very personal story about what it meant for her to try to escape a particular system that she was born into, but she, in a sense, sort of had to exile herself from her brown mother. And what it meant in the end, as she discovered, she became a kind of light-skinned, passing Chicana lesbian, and in many ways had to sort of exile herself from her own family. But in the end, she actually sort of comes back to revisit the memories and the force of her brown mother, and begins to realize that the fact that her mother withheld her love for her was one of the chief ways in which she actually ended up loving women and becoming a lesbian, or at least so Moraga says. So there I try to take us from the sort of system surrounding queer migration issues, entire movements by these tremendously interesting youth who were driving that and thinking intersectionally, but then going to a very sort of personal story from Cherie Moraga to see the types of personal complications that wind around these categories. That again, sometimes we have to live almost in strangely solitary ways, even though it has to do with a massive system in our lives. So that's where I would sort of go with word and system.
Dr. Stockton, while we're waiting on Lauren, one of the sort of anecdotal observations that we've had during the pandemic, because Karis has two trans support groups, one for young, teens and young adults, and then one for parents of trans children. And one of the things that we've seen is while many young people are doing virtual school and they are not in a physical school environment,
Mhm.
it's given those young people a chance to connect with their gender in new ways.
Mm.
And a lot more people are coming out as trans because they've
Mhm.
had the space to think about gender in a way that has not been quite as influenced or pressured by their peers.
Right.
Some people have said, well, there's dysphoria where you're just a brain walking around. Really, in some ways, being virtual enables dysphoria, right? Because all you have to be on a screen is a brain. But I'm just curious if you have any thoughts about that about gender in this particular moment where we aren't really living in physical spaces in our bodies with strangers as much.
Yeah, really interesting question. I mean, I think I would probably, my book ends with a whole look at the question of surface and depth. And you might say, hey, wait a minute, from a deconstructive perspective, that sounds like you're making a new binary, surface and depth. But one of the things that I really am very anxious to say in this book is that surface is deep, right? So as you see me right now, I am really a surface on a screen, right? But you can see hair, you can see my dress, you can see my gestures, you can hear my tone of voice. There's so much information that you think you're getting about me from what you see if you're a sighted person seeing my surface, right? You might be getting something different if you are hearing and just hearing me. So in some ways, ER, it kind of depends on whether kids are on the screen at the same time they're listening, right? So there's a sort of surface presentation that is being read and a sort of constant projection, unfortunately, that we continue to make when we see a particular surface. And one of the things I would love to have us think about, whether it might be helpful for us to sort of sever our notion of surface and depth, even though there's a very intense relationship, right? Obviously, having a certain surface in life may have baked into my thinking very profoundly. And I have to kind of rigorously think about that. Let me just sort of give the obvious example here of a white surface, right? I walk around in life with a white skin surface. And I'm going to be spending my whole life, I have already, trying to understand like what the privilege of that surface might mean. And how has my surface gotten into my thinking? How has it affected the ways that I do or do not struggle with something called white privilege in this world? So we know that surface has a tremendous effect on thoughts that we might think, but we also know that you can't really necessarily go from the surface that you see to the depth that you attach. And I'll just sort of give one example there. If my partner were here, she's given me permission to share this example, you would say that she is probably a cisgendered lesbian if she said that she, was with me, and she usually confesses that she's with me. So she's walking through life with a surface that you might read as normatively feminine. You might say, there's a cisgendered woman. And in many ways that's true. But the problem is, since I know this person, I actually don't think the word cisgender fits her at all in many ways. She does have this privileged, normative feminine surface. So there is some privilege to that, right? She can walk through life sometimes with greater ease than I can. But let me tell you, and I think feminists have made this strong critique, there's also danger attached to a normatively feminine surface for any person walking around in one, right? There can be danger that's attached there. So I think this notion that we can imagine what my partner thinks, like what her mindset might be from the surface that we see, is really not true. And therefore, cisgender, to my mind, is sort of too strong a term. Totally get why we created it. Makes perfect sense. Why does a person who's trans or non-binary have to keep explaining themselves? Why doesn't somebody, for example, that we might call cisgender, have to have a term, have to deal with that, have to think about that? I'm completely down with that. But I'm starting to prefer the term cis surface, which would show that, yes, my partner has a cis surface and she must reckon with what that means. All the privilege, the ease, and sometimes the danger that comes with it. But we shouldn't presume that her mindset, that her gender matches what somebody might call her sex assigned at birth. That's the type of presumption I'd like to get away from. That's a split that I would like to open up. And I think that those of us who are non-binary and genderqueer, we are thinking about that all the time. But we do want, as I say, everybody to have to think that thought. Why am I attached to this surface that I have? I really hope that people get to present to the world the surface that they like. Because again, surface is so intimate, surface is so deep. I think sometimes that's not understood by the general public. Every once in a while, I'll still have somebody say to me, and it's a whole range of folks, right? There's sometimes right-wing people who say this. There's sometimes are very committed feminists who might say this. It's just like, well, why do you have to go changing, the way that you present? Why can't you understand that girls can do more things and there's more possibility here and so forth? And then I try to say, particularly, this works very well with parents, but should work with anybody, given the fact that you're having such a hard time getting used to this new surface that your child is presenting to the world, it should tell you how deep surface runs, because you are so attached, and I get it, to the beauty of this surface that you originally saw. But if your child is telling you, or somebody that you know, this is how I prefer to dress and to present in the world, I need this, this is rigorously part of who I am, then in some ways you might actually understand that from the depth of your own reaction to seeing that change. So if there's one thing that I hope my book can explain, it is the depth and the intimacy of human surface, and why we are attached, and why we must absolutely support the surface changes that people wish to make, while asking people to reckon with the privilege of surface and all of its complexity. Anyway, Lauren, I see you're back. So.
I am, hopefully. Thanks. Sorry about that.
No worries.
I hope it wasn't too disruptive. Sounds like the conversation continued beautifully. We have a question in the chat that actually dovetails well with what you were just stating. So Ren asked in the Q&A, and this is Agnes Scott, WGSS alum, who is now a grad student. Ren asked, I have been thinking lately about the discursive power of some folks, especially young folks, identifying as not cis, which is interesting because that is often considered to be the definition of trans.
Right.
That is a new gender category for young queer folks, seems to be evolving somewhere outside of cis and trans.
Yes.
What are your thoughts on how that might expose the queerness of gender?
Yeah, I think it's so powerful. And again, if we kind of step back to queer theory, right? One of the rigorous things that queer theory was saying is that sexuality really is strange for all of us. So we, as let's say gay people, let's say now I'm identifying as a gay person and I've walked under the term lesbian for a long period in life. I always hated that notion that I have to somehow present myself to my state legislature, whoever, and say, but I'm a good gay person. I'm just like you. Can you not see? I'm a law-abiding, tax-paying citizen. I'm a good person. Let me into your club. I always wanted to turn that on its head and get people to think in a very important way how their own sexuality is strange, is mysterious, does not obey the dictates of heteronormativity. In fact, I would say this both about the term heteronormative and the term cisgender. You can go and knock on a door labeled cisgender and nobody can answer because nobody lives there. That is somebody's ideal form. It's a concept, but nobody can actually live this thing called cisgender because of the squirrely nature of gender for all of us. So you may remember there was a time period, and I think this still happens, when somebody might say, I'm a straight queer person, right? And the idea of straight queers, and that makes perfect sense to me. So many people that I know who you might say, well, looks like they're straight, looks like a man with a woman, but we know that by many of the aspects of their life, they do not fit, this definition of heteronormativity. So I think this discursive play is incredibly helpful. And look how it has changed, right? There was a period of time when trans had a narrower meaning, right? And the type of language that was used in that time period, I'm going to put this all in quotation marks, male to female, man to woman, this idea that you're going from one pole to another. And pretty quickly, the more people who came out under the term trans, one could begin to see the tremendous variety and diversity of trans people living their lives. so that some of these received terms that were being used weren't working anymore. Now, of course, there's trans asterisks, right? So to create this very broad, stretchy notion of trans. So I think the language will keep changing, and I say yay to that. I think queer communities and trans communities and queer and trans communities and communities of color and queer and trans communities of color have been brilliant at the level of creativity, you know, spawning all kinds of language. So as Lauran will know from having read the book, you know, I begin with citing some of the phrases people use for themselves. You know, I'm a dandy butch. That's actually a term that I might use of myself. Somebody else says I'm a farm feminist, you know. Somebody else says, you know, so we have the whole term of the gay otter, you know, which I didn't know until I met a man who identified himself as a gay otter, not a bear, but an otter, you know. So we are very creative, and it doesn't mean that we might not feel these terms strongly. It just means that we're creating them. We might live under that category for the rest of our born days, or it might be, you know, today I'm a gay otter, tomorrow, you know, I'm a dandy butch. So things can change. And I think, thank goodness we have this discursive play to help us out, you know, of some of the binds we've gotten ourselves into discursively.
I think that's one thing, or I know that's one thing I enjoyed about the book is, you know, it's a tough tonal line to walk between celebrating the joy and playfulness of gender while also recognizing its grave consequences and effects. And I think you really do a good job of striking that balance in the book. One thing, I mean, a very important thing, and I think one that makes your book on gender different from many is that race obviously is very central to the text. So you tell us in the book, gender is made of things that are not gender, race, and money. Gender is fundamentally raced and classed in the United States. And so talk us through a couple of examples for folks who maybe aren't familiar with the term, the racialization of gender. And there are so many great ones to choose from, but I'll be curious which ones stand out to you that help demonstrate this raced nature of gender.
Absolutely. And so one of the things that I say throughout the book is I often find I have to use the term racialized gender, but racialized gender is gender because all gender is racialized. So that's what I hope the reader of the book will begin to understand, that these terms could never sit apart from each other. So we're doing that difficult work of understanding. So one of the chapters of my book called Who's My Opposite? I try to show that for any person who even begins thinking about race, you would actually see that we really never have had men and women in the history of this country, right? So you go back to the 13 colonies, and already in the 13 colonies, we have precisely very different categories, legally different categories: white man, white woman, black man, black woman, native man, native woman. Sometimes the word Negro is being used, sometimes the word mulatto, again, all terms in quotation marks. But in other words, from the very founding of this country, distinctions are made that give us at least 6 sexes in the US imagination, right? And then of course, other sexes in other territories, you know, of our country. So let me give you a feel for this, because part of what I want to say, and here I'm just citing so many fantastic scholars of color and the work that they've done, right, to really help us to understand, and of course, this is the conversation we're having in this backlash moment against critical race theory, is we do believe profoundly that these racial histories are still with us right at this moment. They may be changing, but the long roots of having a country that has defined race in these ways from the moment of its founding is in our gender. So let me give one example. In that section of the book, I actually began with Toni Morrison and Eldridge Cleaver as a pair to sort of talk about African-American gender. And I'll just say, because I'm actually not going to talk about that, what's interesting there is if you read Cleaver's Soul on Ice, which is a very highly controversial book. So just know that if you're going to read that book, highly controversial, you'll need to steel yourself, you know, in reading some of that. But to watch a Black Panther sort of figuring out what he saw as a problem for Black men and women is that they were too much the same. because of the way Blackness was being defined. And in particular, he ends up sort of feeling that Black men and Black women are seen as masculine by the dominant culture. So how do we get out of that bind in which Black women and Black men are being conceived of in these sort of masculine terms? You'll have to read that part of the book to see how that goes and how Morrison intervenes. But I want to go to the example actually that comes from Lisa Lowe's book, Immigrant Acts, where if Cleaver and Morrison are sort of tackling the issue that it seems that Black men and women have been conceived of as all masculinized, the inverse seems to be true for Asian men and women, that due to immigrant status, there's a kind of feminization that is spread over both Asian men and Asian women because of citizenship rights or the lack thereof. So for example, if you just take the Page Act from 1875, which blocked the entry of immigrants considered undesirable, right? These were largely Chinese women. So this act was trying to save the United States from cheap Chinese labor and immoral Chinese women. In fact, the notion was that Chinese women carried distinct germs that they were immune to, but that might kill white men. So then you get the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which prohibited all Chinese laborers from immigrating at that point. And what Lisa Lowe is pointing out to us in her profound book is that in many ways, the types of labor that some Asian men were taking on were considered feminine forms of labor, working in restaurants, service sector, laundry. And because of this immigration laws, they lived in bachelor communities where women and wives could not join them where they were. And that the effect of this was to sort of massively feminize Asian gender. And then if you go on to read David Eng's really great book, Racial Castration, and all that he says, the sort of strange myths that stick to what he's calling there the Asian penis. And I know how ridiculous some of this phrasing may sound, but really profound book. You'll get a sense of what David Eng is saying that kind of amps this whole question of the sort of strange feminization across Asian gender and sex. And just last example I'll give, because this one also is just, full of heartbreak in the history of our country, is that the sort of land grab, right, from Native Americans really necessitated, in the minds, obviously, of white people who were doing it, a kind of gendercide on Native Americans. And particularly understanding that the land grab and that, Native people's genocide was also a sexual atrocity in the history of this country. So I'll just give you one phrase that probably everybody on this screen has heard before, the odious phrase, kill the Indian, save the man, which is sort of central to the Indian boarding schools at the end of the 19th century. So not only were Native kids being taken from their Native genderings and sexualities that were happening in their own cultural settings, but they were being immersed in the sexual stylings of white men and women. However, as you see here from that very phrase, kill the Indian, save the man, basically education then was part of this murderous process of killing Native children into being men and women. I mean, I just can't say that enough, how just unbelievable that is. And just to add two more kickers to that, this, however, was constantly a scene of failed assimilation. In other words, assimilation was almost always guaranteed to fail because of blood quantum rules and because also the graduation rates of these boarding schools were atrocious. There were terrible acts of corporal punishment and sexual assault. So it was really being set up that Native children could not remain in their Native culture, but they also were being made into failed heterosexuals. They could not be men and women in this particular way. And as somebody like Mary Zaborski, as a scholar says, calls this Native children being doubly queered. First, their own Native kinship patterns are seen as strange, and then they're made strange again by being made into failed heterosexuals. So there's so much I could say about that. One thing I'll just end on is we may remember what the United States was up to during the time of Thomas Jefferson, right? Where clearly the United States had this plan to try to impose colonial gender onto Native people. So now here I'm thinking about the Cherokee quite specifically, and to get Native men no longer to be hunting in the forest, but to actually do agriculture, That displaced the women who were doing agriculture to their homes to work on looms. And the entire thing is confessed by Thomas Jefferson in 1803 when he says, then maybe native peoples will understand that they have no use for their extensive forests. I mean, that should just chill us all to the bone, that this plan of what was done to native people by trying to roll colonial gender on top of them, the entire plan was a land grab, and it's confessed by the likes of Thomas Jefferson. So those are some examples why, in a sense, we can't have sexual opposites, because if there's 6 or more sexes that have been very much in motion in the history of our country, then who's my opposite if there are 6 sexes or more?
Yeah, the Thomas Jefferson quote was just astounding. I had not seen it before. And you rightly say it in the book. How could your gender as a person of color match a white sex that is male or female that has excluded you?
Right.
And I think that's just such a powerful intervention that you're making there. And there are so many wonderful examples from the history of, or horrifying examples, unfortunately, but compelling ones, history of gynecology, your labor as a theme throughout, and there comes the money and class of gender, but labor is a theme that you track throughout the text that I think many times when we're talking about gender, that falls out.
And again, if you read the great work of Hortense Spillers and C. Riley Snorton, right? Read C. Riley Snorton's book, Black on Both Sides, which is a racial history of trans, in the United States. Then Snorton helps to kind of give us this whole history of the just sick twist surrounding the birth of gynecology, the field of women's medicine, where these horrific operations are being performed on Black female bodies in order to found the field of gynecology and women's medicine. But women's medicine is a category that could not include Black women. I mean, there you have it right there in this chilling way that is there in the historical record to be read.
It really is. And when you put it in that way, it just is such a gut punch, as it should be. So I'm keeping an eye on the clock. Well, one thing that you talked about so many different groups in the text and thinkers. You do talk in chapter 2, When Was Gender, which I love the title of that chapter. You talk about the Combahee River Collective. It's one of my favorite feminist activist groups from the 1970s. And they, many, I think people have not known who they were. They have got a resurgence of attention. More people are looking to them, including folks like the founders of Black Lives Matter.
Absolutely.
And others. But I wanted you to say a little bit about why you turned to them in a book about gender. And at the end of the book, you leave us thinking about care. And so if you'll just talk a little bit about the CRC and then the connection to care, which I found really interesting.
Great. So I talk about the moment in the book where I bring Combahee in, and that is, of course, a text I have long taught, being an old school feminist and a newfangled feminist altogether. So that section comes right after I actually talk about Luce Irigaray and try to kind of encapsulate some interesting things that come out of French feminism and Irigaray quite specifically. And Irigaray's sort of intense focus on the labial lips, right? And I kind of do a whole number on that. But one of the things that, of course, that Irigaray was so passionate about is that, in a sense, and it comes from her book title, This Sex Which Is Not One, right? The way in which there have been so many things about women's bodies and about women sort of defining sex and gender on their own terms, instead of women always being a photographic negative to the term man, right? So Irigaray is trying to work to make women seen and to be seen as unseen. Well, there I want to then go right into Combahee, because here's this incredible collective of Black feminist lesbians and talk about a sex which is not one, right? A group of people who felt there was no category to hold them. because there's Black and there's woman, and there's race and there's sex. And in their case, there's even the term lesbian. So in some ways, I went back to the statement, which I've taught so many times, and 3 different statements jumped out at me. I'll just sort of point to them quickly because I think they're the powerful core of that essay for me. One statement that is so important, and it has the word care in it, so it gets to your question, Lauran. Here's a statement from the Combahee Collective. We realize that the only people who care enough about us to work consistently for our liberation are us. And that's like a statement that should just be a sword in the heart to everyone. That here people who are living under, sometimes the term double jeopardy is being used, or triple jeopardy, right, in the case of Combahee. Did anybody care enough? It's almost like they present themselves as an algebraic X that no one cared enough to solve for. And so this term care for me comes out of Combahee, and it holds 2 things together, which I always love, a kind of fierce politics and a tender rendering. So the care for me from their work is a fierce and tender term in a very particular way. And of course, then they go on to say, and you can hear an echo here for Black Lives Matter, if Black women were free, it would mean everyone else would have to be free. And then they go on to tackle the issue about the status of feminism in Black communities where they remain. They do not become separatist lesbians. They want to stay inside Black communities and work these things through in Black communities. So I think of care at the end of the book as being exquisite speaking back, a collective pushing back, and a creative giving back that we really see in Combahee so profoundly. And that for me felt like the word to end on. That the word care is not this sort of soft ethics of care term, like, oh, we associate care with women. No. It's fierce. It is speaking back to the forces of debility aimed at them at every turn. And I think that's why Combahee in this post-George Floyd period, and with the profound work of Black Lives Matter, has emerged, as a central text again.
I agree. And it really, I love, I will now, every time I teach that piece, I have a whole class organized around that statement. I will think about this and the care that they also took in crafting really smart, sharp analyses.
Yes.
And really taking feminism as an analytical lens and showing it as a tool.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and so thinking of that even as a practice of
right. And again, notice the practice too of saying to white women, this is very definitely your issue. Your lives are made toxic by racism too. How can you not see this as your issue? And you can kind of see, right, what we're saying often to people who are thinking like, let me understand these strange genders now in front of me. Again, we're saying your life has been made toxic from the sex gender system we've all been subject to. That system of sex gender that is racialized gender at every turn.
Well, I think that is a great place for us to stop, and hopefully gave folks a taste of the wonderful book so they can read more. ER, we're going to pass the mic back to you.
Lauran, thank you so much.
Thank you, Kathryn. This was delightful.
And ER, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just so grateful for all of your work through the years and for pointing the way to so many other people's work. So I dropped links to many of those books that you mentioned in the chat so that folks can, dive deeper if some of those books or names were new to you. This chat will stay up in perpetuity. So if you have to rush off, don't worry. You can just come back to this URL and click through and continue to research. And I link to Karis, but of course, many of these books are available through Agnes Scott's library if you're a student, because they are academic titles. They're not super cheap. So don't stress out if you don't have the money to buy them. You can get them in many academic libraries and they are accessible. And certainly the Combahee River Collective Statement is online for free as a PDF. And it's very short, so everyone should read that. We would love for you to buy Genders, Dr. Stockton's book, directly from Karis, and you can do that via the teal link at the bottom of the screen. Somebody asked a really good question, which is it on the shelf at Karis right this moment? I think so, but I am working from home, so I don't know. Our stock changes so fast, so I can't guarantee it is on the shelf, but it's certainly in a box, getting ready. It's in transit. It's ready to go. So the fastest and most assured way to make sure you get your book quickly is to place an online order, even if you live right across the street, and we'll make sure that we have one saved for you under your name, and you can pick it up at the store. And the final thing is I'll be adding captions to this and putting it up on our YouTube channel. Our Karis YouTube channel is just youtube.com/Karis Circle. So please feel free to check that out. There's a great backlog and archive of tons of videos from the pandemic. So if you're ever bored on an evening and want to go for a deep dive, there's so much good material there. But we'll also just ask that if you're going to share this event, that you share that link because it is more accessible. So thank you, Dr. Whitworth. Thank you, Dr. Stockton. What a wonderful way to spend a lunch hour.
For me as well. Thank you, everybody. Lauran, much love.
Take care. Be well.
All right.